I just welcomed everybody who's sitting outside in the beauty of Wednesday morning here at Ocean River, watching either online or through Facebook Live, and I'm not sure that anyone is on Zoom yet, but I'll welcome you in when that time comes. So we're coming to our last 2 weeks of the book of Acts, and here's my question. Is this the end? Or is it the end of the beginning?
It's the beginning of the beginning.
It's what, Frank?
It's the end. It's the beginning.
End of the beginning.
It really is the end of the beginning, isn't it?
Yes.
Because what began, you remember all the way back with Pentecost in Acts chapter 2? Do you remember all the way back in the 6th chapter of the book of Acts, when Paul persecution comes and the church begins to move out all over the world, and then Peter, his incredible ministry with Cornelius at Caesarea Maritima, and then after that the conversion of Paul, the enormously important gathering in the 15th chapter of the book of Acts, where the controversy regarding Gentiles, can they be part of are they required to keep the commandments, the observances of the Jewish law? And then Paul's travels all over the world through his 3 missionary journeys, and then as he made his way back to Jerusalem and is under house arrest at Caesarea Maritima, where he spends 2 years there. And now he has made his appeal to Caesar. He has appeared before Felix. He has spoken before Festus. And he has also spoken before Agrippa. And now it's time for the journey to Rome to begin. But before we pray and start, if you'll look at the first page of your notes there, I just pulled out this biography, this biographical part of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, in which he is in, but not a prideful boasting, but rather as a response to the prideful boasting of the Corinthians. To be called as the pastor of the first church of Corinth was not something that you would simply stand in line to get because of the challenges that were faced there. But just listen to what he writes to them about what he has endured. He said, I have worked much harder. I have what next?
Been in prison.
More frequently. I have been what?
Flogged.
More severely. And I have been exposed to death one time, right?
Again and again.
Again and again. How many times did he receive the 39 lashes, the 40 lashes minus 1?
5.
How many would it have taken you or me to say, I'm done?
About half.
About halfway through the first one, right? I would have said, all right, that's it. How many times was he beaten with rods?
3.
How many times was he pelted with stones?
1.
And we're not talking little tiny stones, are we? I've mentioned to you the wonderful book, I can't remember the author's name. He's a secular Jewish writer from New York, and he wrote a book called The Year of Living Biblically. And it was during that year that he attempted to keep all 613 commands of the law. One of which was you had to stone an adulterer. And so, how do you find an adulterer? So what he did, Nancy wouldn't admit it, he goes into Central Park, he puts a handful of pebbles in his pockets, and then he is going around asking men, not women, he's asking men, are you an adulterer? And he finally comes to one honest man in Central Park who says, yes, I am. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out this little handful of pebbles and throws them at the guy and runs for his life. Paul was not pelted with these little pebbles in Central Park, but these stones. He says 3 times I was what? Shipwreck. I spent a day and a night in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from what? Rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from, in danger from, in danger in the, in danger in the, in danger at, and in danger from. Wow. Okay. Then he says, I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Beside everything else, I face the daily pressure of what? Which churches?
All the churches.
Okay, which ones are all? What's the first one? The church in Jerusalem, the Jewish Christians in the church in Jerusalem. The church, what was the first one he visited? In Galatia. Okay, it's church in Antioch, yes. Okay, and then the church in Galatia. Which other church? Come on, you turkey fans. Huh? Ephesus. Corinth, Thessalonica, Berea, as he went down the coast, the church in Athens, the church in Persia, the church in Phrygia, yeah, and the church in Colossae. Can you imagine how many of you face pressure? None of you at any time in your career, right? How many of us, we say, yeah, I know what a little bit of pressure is. Can you imagine the pressure that he lived under as the one who was really used of God to begin all of these churches? And he said, if I'm going to boast, what does he boast about? Well, wait till the power takeoff is over back here. Probably some of you can tell by the sound what kind of plane that was. Okay, he says, if I'm going to boast, what am I going to boast in? Things that show my weakness. And he said, because when I am weak, then I'm what? Then I'm strong, and God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Well, that's a hard thing for all of us, I know, for this person to really be able to embrace. It's important to recall what the Lord told Ananias when he was sent to Paul in Damascus. Read that verse with me. I'm going to show him how much he must suffer. And we just read through an autobiography of his sufferings, did we not? How does that make you feel about Paul? What?
A real deal.
He's the real deal. Anybody else?
What a man.
What a man. Yeah. Anybody else?
I thought he had physically larger and stronger than I see in some of these videos.
Physically larger and stronger, but in fact, when you read a description of him from the first century, he was a diminutive little bow-legged Jew with a hook nose. That's how he is described in the history from the first century of people who claim to have seen it.
I
So
wonder how he could have lived through any of this.
how did he, how could anybody?
Yes,
God was with him. There's Jackie. Therein is the answer. And God gave him the strength that he needed to endure, not just to endure, but really to thrive in the purposes of God through it all.
God kept raising him from the dead.
Yeah. And this was written before his tumultuous experience in Jerusalem. He was probably in prison in Ephesus when he wrote that letter to the Corinthians. And so he could add to his biography. And Aristarchus is specifically mentioned in this passage that we're going to read as his traveling companion. He was with Paul in Ephesus when the riot broke up, and he and Gaius were two of the people that were hauled into the arena in Ephesus. And I would have thought, I think I want to travel with somebody else. Did he walk away from that traveling companion? Not at all. He stayed with him through thick and thin. So as we come to what is the, not Kim Elliott is signing in. Let me accept you screen. You're unmuted. And you're invited. Oh, no. I still don't know what I'm doing with Zoom. So, but Kim, I hope you're there. So at any rate, with that in mind, let's pray our prayer that we've been praying as we come to the end of the beginning together. Lord, help us see you more clearly in order that we might love you more dearly and follow you more nearly day by day. Amen. And is the Lord who was there at the end of the beginning still the Lord who is with us wherever we are in the journey? And the answer is yes. Thanks be to God. Amen. Okay, so discover. Here's how we're going to break this out. If we don't get all the way through it, we're going to start with Paul getting underway, and then sailing toward trouble. He obviously did not. They obviously did not have the radar and everything that you guys have on your boats today. The experience of a violent storm, the encouraging word that he was given by God that he passed on in the middle of this storm, then the experience of being shipwrecked, and the miracle that took place on Malta. So that's what we're going to try and cover most of today. So let's start with getting underway. And Frank, would you read Acts 27, 3 through 8 for us? It's at the top of page 2 in your notes.
The next day, we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again, and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea, off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salome. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea.
Okay, we're very, very fortunate that someone plotted all of the GPS coordinates on your map, okay, so that you can see where he went. But if you see him leaving Caesarea, there on the coast of Israel, sailing just north to Sidon, and then sailing to the north and a bit to the west, and then turning due west and making his way all across the south coast of what today would be Turkey. And then we see him sailing to the lee side of Crete, of the island there, and then turning due south for Crete. So in case you didn't have this picture in mind any more than I did when we started, now how many of you, Ron, did you sail this at some point?
Yes.
You've sailed this. Anybody else in here that sailed it? How many of us would like to be invited to go with Ron and Tina on the next trip that you? Okay, so how does this centurion treat Paul? With kindness. So is Julius an honorable man? Absolutely. How was the passage sailing from Sidon there on the west coast of Israel, what would be Lebanon today, and then Myra, you see all the way down here. What was the voyage like getting there? Huh? Uneventful. Pretty much uneventful, right? Smooth sailing, as we would say. But then as you come to the end of it, he said we moved along, it was smooth sailing, but he said we moved along the course with what kind of adverb?
Slow.
Well, slow and difficult, okay? Then he turns south, and he comes to a harbor on the south side of the island of Crete called what? Fair Havens. So for those of you who are sailors, and if you looked on your charts and you saw a harbor called Fair Havens, what would you expect to find there?
Pretty nice.
Pretty nice.
Yeah.
Okay, you would hope there'd be showers, restaurants, libation, everything that you re-provision your boat as you go along. But when they get to Fair Havens, we're going to discover they are sailing toward trouble. Carol, would you read the next part of the text, chapter 27, 9 through 12?
Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. It was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest.
So Fair Havens was a fair harbor in what kind of weather?
Summer.
Fair weather. Okay, not the place you want to find mooring during the winter. So why was sailing dangerous this time of year? There's a hint of a date. What's the hint of the date? It was after the Day of Atonement. How many of you went back and found out when the Day of Atonement was in year 59? How many of you are glad I did? Okay. This is one of those things you don't keep in your trivia in the back of your mind, but now we can all add it to that. It was after the Day of Atonement, and the Day of Atonement in the year 59 took place, top of page 3, on what date? October the 5th. And we're indebted to a wonderful British scholar in the 19th century whose name was Sir William Ramsay. And Ramsay wrote a series of books, one of which is called St. Paul, the Roman traveler and Roman citizen. And what Ramsay did, he went back and documented all of this journey at the different times. And so we're really indebted to his research about this time. And Ramsay is the one who tells us that if you were going to be sailing in this part of the world, when did you need to have your trip wrapped up by? Beginning of November. But for those of you who've sailed or flown, does bad weather respect the calendar? Does it ever maybe come on a little bit ahead of time or a little bit after? And if you're getting close to it and you're deciding to sail, what are you hoping for? What are you hoping for? That it holds off, right? That it'll hold off. Well, Paul, what was Paul's insight into what was going to take place? What did he tell them? It's not going to be good, but he didn't just say it's not going to be good and leave it in generalities. What were the specifics? Loss of ship, loss of all the cargo, loss of the ship, loss of your lives. And the centurion, who had been generous to him at first, had a choice between listening to Paul or listening to whom? The pilot and the owner of the ship. You remember Jesus when Peter gets with him in the boat, and after Jesus he finishes teaching, and he says, "Pete, put out into the deep water and let your nets down." And Peter thought to himself, what? He said, "Lord, we've been fishing all night, okay? You are no fisherman. You're a nice guy. We're fishermen. You really don't know what you're talking about, but because you say so, we'll do what? We'll let them down." What happened?
The nets get full.
All kinds of fish. A miraculous catch. So, the centurion is caught between Paul. Is Paul an experienced seaman? Does Paul have experience of sailing in the oceans at this time of year? Paul is a pessimist, the pilot said, and we know sailing, and we know it's not the 1st of November yet, and we think the bad weather will hold off. Who did the centurion listen to? How long did he have to think he made the right decision? One day. One day. And so, Kay, would you read to us about the violent storm in Acts chapter 27, verses 13 through 20?
Sure. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchors and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the nor'easter, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Coda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering in the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved.
Anybody want to go? Okay, why were they encouraged enough to break anchor and leave the harbor? What kind of wind did they have? A wind coming from the south. Look at your map. Where did they want to go? They wanted to go what direction? North. They wanted to go. So what kind of wind, if you're sailing, do you hope you have to get where you want to go? You hope you have a south wind so that you can roll out the spinnaker and you can ride into Rome with all your colors flying and your burgee on the back of the boat, right? What happened? The wind changed. That's a moderate understatement, is it not? What kind of wind began to blow? A nor'easter, a hurricane. How many of you have been in memorable storms in your life? Anybody who's sailed? Two of the worst seas Jane and I have ever been in have been on the Med, but it was in a much larger ship. We were on one that held about 250 of us. We were sailing out of Piraeus, which is the harbor there at Athens, and we had all of our guests up in the lounge on top of the ship, and the swells were running about 12 to 14 feet. And all of our guests up there, well, the furniture was sliding from one side of the ship to the other, and before long, Jane and I looked around. We were the only ones there. Everybody else had left us. I cannot imagine what some of you may have been through in a smaller boat about the size of this grain ship. Now, why didn't the captain fire up the Volvos and motor? Yeah, stupid question, Bob. There were no such things, right? Okay, if you're sailing in a vessel like that, can you tack into the wind? There's a description in the book of James. You get driven by the wind and what? Tossed. And that became the experience that they went through. What were the problems that they faced as the force of this storm? Okay, I'm getting a phone call here. At any rate, we'll have to ignore that. So what were the problems, the challenges they started facing?
Well, they had a lifeboat that was attached, a lifeboat, and it must have been bouncing around and was not secure. So that was a problem.
That was a problem. What else was a problem?
Sounds like their ship's falling apart.
Ship starts falling apart. Anybody been through that? I've been on board a 49-foot sailing boat with a friend when we came around the the Cape there in Southern California, where you turn back to the east going to Los Angeles, having come by Santa Barbara, and we lost the boom. It broke in half, but there was no danger of this ship coming apart. So what would it have been like to try and hold that thing together with ropes? Unimaginable. And somebody tell me what the tackle on a sailboat is.
I think it's the ropes and those.
Lines run through that you control everything. What did the crew finally do with the tackle?
They just put it overboard.
With their and Luke adds a very personal observation, with their own hands. Okay, tell me what the emotion they were experiencing in the midst of this was. Desperate, panic. Anybody else? We're all going to what? They had given up all hope of being. You ever been in that kind of place before? Where absolute loss of hope. It's over. The ship falls apart. You don't have inflatable lifeboats that have water on board. The waves come over you, you drown. Who's the one guy who doesn't seem to be quite so anxious on the boat? The Apostle Paul. Okay? Luke's describing everybody on board. A wonderful friend, Louis Evans Jr. Louis had been the pastor of National Presbyterian Church for many years, and we were going through a crisis of leadership in a church where I was on the staff. And I'll never forget Louis coming to me and saying, "Bob, what people like you need to learn to be is an unanxious presence in the midst of the crisis." And I went, "Louis, I don't think I can be unanxious." He said, "How about being less anxious?" How many of you have had that experience where you have had to be the less anxious presence when everything around you felt like you were going crazy, and what you were praying is that your being less anxious would have what kind of impact on the environment? Calming. I wonder how much of a calming impact Paul's less anxious presence had in that moment where they all knew they were going to die. So let's turn to Paul's encouraging word. And Cynthia, would you read verses 21 to 26 of Acts chapter 27?
After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves the damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God is ready to give you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage again, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as you told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'"
Wow. So, had the ship's galley been open during the storm? Not exactly. How long had they gone without food? A long time is what we're told. And how many of you don't like to hear, "Told you so"? Right? It's not the most welcome word when you didn't pay attention in the first place like you should have, and things unfold and go a little crazy. I wonder if Paul prayed about saying that before he said it, you know? But what did he say to them? "Told you so. Wish you would have listened to me." But where did his ability to be that less anxious presence, where did that come from? It came from his confidence in God, didn't it? It came from a word that God spoke to him. How many of you, not audibly, but at some point in your life, like I have had God speak a word to you that brought peace to your heart that there's no other explanation for? Then God, all of us who are here, and I hope all of you who are watching have had that experience of God speaking that word to your heart. Well, was Paul's word encouraging to him? What was encouraging about it?
They weren't going to die.
We're going to be all right. Yeah. And what it was also realistic. What was the realism that came with the encouragement?
Tough times
We're going to be a wreck. The ship's going to be a wreck, and we're not going to have, what's that tug service? Towboat US is not going to come out from the harbor and put a line onto us and drag us in. What are we going to have to do? We're going to have to run aground somewhere. Would you have been encouraged if you were on board? Now, are there any doubters in the crowd along with me? Okay, I would have said, Paul, man, if I'm Aristarchus, and I've been with you for a long time, and we've been through thick and thin, but I'm just wondering if you're not stretching this faith thing just a little bit right now. And so Paul, he says, nope, I've heard from God, and you guys didn't listen to me in the first place, but I want you to listen to me now, because everything is going to be all right in terms of our lives, just not all this ship and the cargo that you've been throwing overboard for the last 2 weeks in the ship. So, Cynthia, you just read, didn't you?
Yeah, I just read.
Okay, Laura Lynn, would you read the Shipwreck, please, in verses 27 through 44?
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors left the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. He broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind, and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move. The stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely.
Wow. Absolutely astounding, isn't it? So, how many nights had they been in the storm? At least
14.
at least 14 nights. And what did the sailors have a sense of?
They were approaching land.
Yeah. What is, those of you who are blue water people, what gave them a sense that they were getting closer to land? What's one thing it might have been?
Yeah.
Sounding.
Did the sounding? What else happens as you move into shallower water? Color changes. The waves get different, okay, depending on the bottom and how they're formed. So the first time they took a sounding, how deep was the water? 120 feet. Second time, just a little time later, okay, so 30 feet more. What was the danger that they faced? Crashing into the rocks. Not a good thing, is it? Our oldest son was an avid surfer in our Los Angeles years. And he and his buddies liked to surf near the rocks. And I cannot tell you how many times he came home and Nurse Jane had to take out the butterflies, or we went to the doc's office to get the stitches. As a diver who has been caught up in surge on a coral reef, let me tell you, it's not a place you want to be caught in surge, is it? So they had a legitimate fear that if they ran aground on the rocks, what would happen to them? They could be cut to pieces by what they would experience there. So how did they respond when they thought that might happen? What did they cut loose? All four of the anchors that they'd been dragging from the back of the boat, right? And what did some of the crew decide to do?
Escape.
We're going to get out of here. And what was their means of getting out? They were going to get in that lifeboat. They were pretending to do what? Okay, we're going to put some anchors down. Who saw what was going on? Okay, Paul turns to the centurion and the soldiers, and what does he say to them?
Unless he's been saved with a ship, you cannot be saved.
If you let those guys get away, guess what's going to happen to you?
Down you go.
Down you go. So how long did it take them to break out the swords?
1 second.
And what did they do? They hacked right through the ropes, and the lifeboat goes goodbye. And however many of those guys there were, have egg on their face. They did not draw confidence from what Paul said. And so they're going to find out that Paul really did hear from God, because they have to stay on the ship. Who seems to be in command of the ship right now? You think?
Yeah.
Who was in command when the decision was made to sail? The pilot, the owner of the ship. Where has the owner of the ship been? Well, if there was a captain's cabin, he was maybe cowering in the cabin, right? And who is at the helm now? The Apostle Paul. Because he wants to prove himself proud? No. Because God has given him the strength to give the leadership and the encouragement that's needed in the midst of this crisis. What impact, what did Paul tell them to do? He said, you've been without something for a long time.
Time to eat.
Been without food. Time to eat. Who set the pattern of eating? Paul did. And when everybody saw Paul eating, what did they do? They broke into their bagels or whatever it was they had on board, and they ate. And how much did they eat?
They were full.
Do you ever remember a time where somebody blessed bread and ate it and gave it and distributed it, and everyone ate till they were full? Does it remind you of somebody? It reminds us of the feeding of the 5,000. And what happened? Well, there were not 5,000, but how many? 276. They ate their fill. They were strengthened. Then what did they do with the grain on the ship? It's like the Boston Tea Party, except this is the Roman grain party. Get rid of it. Why do you do that?
Lighten
You
the
lighten the ship, and when you lighten the ship, what happens? It doesn't, the less draft on the ship, so hopefully if there's rocks there we might hit, maybe we'll miss them, all right? And what did they see up ahead that gave them encouragement? Sandy beach. And when you saw a sandy beach, they said, let's make for it. So what did they cut? They got rid of the ropes around the rudder, and they're just letting the what? The force of the wind and the sail drive them onto the beach. What finally happened to the ship? Ran aground, and I mean, I've seen pictures of shipwrecks that have been caught in the surf for a long time. What does heavy surf do to a shipwreck? Just batters it into pieces. What were the soldiers planning to do with the prisoners?
Kill them.
Why would they want to do that?
They have no way to.
Because we've seen this movie before. When soldiers have prisoners who get away, what happens to their lives? They lose their lives. So they're saying, okay, we're not gonna die. The centurion intervenes and he stops it. And because of it, who lives? Paul and everyone on board the boat. So what does the centurion do? He says, how many of you can swim? What did you tell them to do? Jump overboard, get to land, and then to those he said, how many of you can't swim? And, you know, the rest of them, yeah. And he says, jump in the water, but as you're jumping, do what? take your PFD with you, right? That personal, no, grab a plank, whatever you can find that'll float, and hang on to it. And when they did a head count, when everybody got to the beach, how many people were there? All 276. And how were, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the outcome, all 276. Now we come to the incredible miracle on what island? Did they know it was Malta when they landed there? They didn't have any idea, did they? Chuck, would you read chapter 28, verses 1 through 10, please?
Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness, built a fire, and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper driven out by the heat fastened itself to his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, goddess justice has not allowed him to live." And Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and saying nothing unusual happened to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with all the supplies we needed.
So what was their welcome on Malta? Wonderful kindness. There are these sailing societies, aren't there, in places of the world that have been on the lookout for ships in distress. I think I've heard about it in Scotland or Ireland or somewhere, and you know they bring them ashore and they treat them with kindness. Well, that's obviously what they did for them on Malta. Malta was known one time as Melita, and what Roman province was it part of? Sicily. Yeah, Jane and I have been on Sicily once. You can send me back there anytime you want to. It was wonderful. We've even got a Sicilian in the audience, right?
Yeah.
Half Sicilian.
Yeah.
Is that the better half?
Depends point of view.
It depends on your
It's
point of.
actually a good part.
It's a good part, absolutely. So, what happened when Paul's gathering firewood? So, there's some of you who are like I am on Facebook from time to time. Have any of you ever seen the picture of the tree? And what it tells you to do is find the copperhead in the tree. Have any of you ever seen that?
Yeah, I have.
Well, this kid grew up in Texas with copperheads. And if you don't know what copperheads would do in oak trees, they would wind their way up through the rivers of bark. And they would be hanging there just about at shoulder height. And you, if you were not looking carefully, the coloration was exactly like the oak bark. And many a kid, many an adult there is, who carelessly approached an oak tree, and what did they find themselves being the victim of? A viper's bite, of a copperhead bite. And depending on your condition, it could kill you. And so what came out of the brush that Paul is gathering? A viper. And it obviously attached itself to the most accessible part of his body, which was his hand. And all of these nice people on Malta, when they saw this, what was their immediate conclusion?
Bad guy.
Bad guy.
Bad guy.
Okay? And what's going to happen to him?
God's going to die.
Which God?
Their God.
The goddess Justice. And the goddess Justice in their minds was the goddess not only of justice, but of what? Revenge. How many of you have heard the expression, payback is really sweet? Okay? Or karma, or dharma. Well, they thought Paul was getting what was coming to him, right? Obviously, he's on this ship and he's a prisoner because he's a murderer. So when he shook the snake off, they all sat back in their chairs, and what were they waiting on? They were waiting on the neurotoxin to start impacting his body, swell up. If you've ever seen the outcome of a rattlesnake bite or a bite of another snake like that, the venom, you swell up. And not only, well, oh, he's swelling up now. What follows the swelling?
Falls down dead.
Not too long after the dropping dead. But what surprised them?
He didn't swell up.
None of that happened. So they're quick to change their mind. Instead of being a murderer who justice was exacting revenge on, he had to be a god. And so Paul obviously saying, no, I'm not a god at all. And nearby, whose estate was there? Publius. And what was he? Chief official on the island. And what did he do? Welcome them. Paul goes inside. Generous hospitality, but also who does he find there? His dad. And sick and dysentery, not a good thing. What does Paul do first?
Went in to see him.
Goes to see him. What does he do next?
Prayer.
He prays. Why does he pray? For guidance. For help from God. I've maybe told you before, one of the most profound experiences of prayer that I've ever had with a group of elders, men and women of church, was for a dear friend back in Wichita whose name was Marcel Wagamuth. And Marcel was one of our elders dying of cancer. And I was away on study leave, and I got the call from Jane saying, Bob, Marcel's dying. You need to get back here. So I said, great, I'll be back. We'll gather in her home tonight. Tell all the elders to come. And so I'm kneeling in front of Marcel with the elders around, and I have not prayed about what to pray. Instead, I immediately launch into a prayer for her healing. I learned a lesson, unlike, it's one I'll never forget. She stopped me in the middle of the prayer. And she said, Bob, do not pray for my healing. Pray for a good death. Yeah, from that moment on, have never had the hubris to think I know what needs to be prayed for. I will say, how do you want me to pray? Or what do you, Lord, what do I and the others feel we should pray for together? And that verse really stopped me in my tracks when I read this again. Before Paul prayed for healing, what did he first do? He first prayed to ask God how he should pray. There's another wonderful story that happened a few weeks later. In fact, just before Jane and I were leaving to take the call to Sun Valley, a dear doctor friend of ours had just come from seeing a friend of ours who's a very prominent banker in town. And she said to me, you get over to their house right now, because he's just found out that he has lymphoma. And so, oh, here comes John Bull. And so at any rate, here I am in front of my friend and his wife, and I'm kneeling in front of him. And I asked him, I said, called him by name, and I said, how do you want me to pray? And here was his answer. Excuse me for being a little graphic online. He said, I want you to pray that God is going to get glory, or I'm really going to be pissed off. That was 20 years ago. I just saw my friend online. Not only did he build a successful banking system whose name was Cross First, he is now heading up a phenomenal organization that is challenging people who have been blessed with the same kind of enormous wealth that he has to use it for generous and productive causes. God answered the prayer that day because God has gotten glory through the life